Governor Bruce Rauner next week will give his State of the State address, but he's given us a glimpse of what he's going to say. Unions don't like what they're hearing. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Bruce Rauner will give his first speech as governor next week. It's his State of the State address, but he's been making the rounds, giving a preview of that address. Unions don't like what they're hearing. We're going to talk about that and some other things on this week's edition of Capitol View. I'm Amanda Vinicky, the State House Bureau Chief for Illinois Public Radio and WUIS, and guests on Capitol View this week are head of the Public Affairs Reporting Program, Charlie Wheeler. That's a program out of the University of Illinois, Springfield, of course, and also Illinois Times Ace reporter, Pat Yeagle. Thanks, guys. So, we all have been waiting to hear what Bruce Rauner is actually going to do now that he is governor. And we still haven't gotten a whole ton of that, but we are beginning to get glimpses of what's to come. He says that he's presenting the challenges, and he's doing that in the form of speeches, basically, actually PowerPoint presentations. It reminded me of him being like a college professor up there with slides and making his case, basically. And he's done that 4 times now. He started with the University of Chicago, speaking to a group of students, then to a suburban mayor's organization, then this week at Richland Community College in Decatur, and finally at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And each time it was the same basic foundation, but then he added a little bit more, and I think each time angered people a bit more while he was at it. So why don't we'll get to the juicy stuff in just a bit. Plenty to talk about with unions. Let's talk about, however, what he says are the challenges, the portrait that he is painting of the state with this PowerPoint, with the slides that he's showing. And he says, Illinois is behind. Let's at least aspire to be average. That's a joke that he makes that gets some chuckles. We can't even do that. Is that funny? Is Illinois that bad? Charlie?
I don't think it is. I think you can cherry pick the statistics to make us look worse than we are, but we're still a state that has a lot of strengths. Over the course of decades, we've not funded our public employee pensions the way we should have, and we've used that money to pay for other things. So you could say we've been living beyond our means probably for almost 100 years, and now the time has come to deal with that. But on the other hand, you look at our tax structure. We have a flat rate income tax. Most of our neighbors with income tax have a graduated rate, where people with higher incomes pay on that additional income a much higher percentage than they do in Illinois. We don't tax most services. We tax a handful of services, many fewer than all our neighboring states. We don't tax retirement income. So you might say, Illinois taxes are out of hand. But actually, if we had the same tax structure as some of our neighboring states, we'd be much better off financially. But part of the campaign, if you will, for Governor Rauner was to portray Illinois as the worst state in the union, on the brink of the abyss, about to slide into oblivion.
Death spiral.
And it's all Pat Quinn's fault. And so now Bruce Rauner is the governor, and it's time, in my judgment, for him to lay aside all the campaign BS and get down to brass tacks. And to me, in these recent speeches you alluded to, he's reverting back to his primary persona before the primary election, right, where he had to attack the unions, he had to demonize state workers because they make too much money, blah, blah, blah. And I find that kind of offensive from a guy whose income, and not actually from hard labor where you get a salary, but his income from his investments is something like $60 million. Most of those people he demonizes won't, in the course of their lifetime, earn that much money. So I think it's just in poor taste. Again, this is in my judgment. And I think he would be a better governor if he would, instead of trying to demonize people, if you try and lay out what we really need to do.
Well, I want to return back to this notion of maybe two sides of Rauner, the two faces that he's presenting. But first, although he is getting into and making the case that Illinois has challenges deeper than he had expected. We were beginning to hear that from even before his actual inauguration, kind of building up this case of why there will be pain ahead. In a way, I think that's smart politically for him. You are going to have either cuts or revenue increases, maybe a mixture of both. People won't like it, and you want to know why. And whereas reporters have often given him grief, like, hey, bud, you ran for governor. Where were you? How can you pretend to be surprised? There was a recent study by the Institute of Government and Political Affairs out of the University of Illinois that, in a way, kind of seemed to give him more fodder, that said, we knew it was this bad because we knew the pension debt, but it's not just the general funds. There are all these other funds. In fact, the situation is worse than many people presumed. And, when I listen to Rauner give these speeches, there are cases, he talks, for example, about fixing pensions and this issue of salaries getting bumped up at the end of, say, a teacher's career so that their pension would be based on this higher salary, and then it'd be on the backs of taxpayers to pay them a larger retirement benefits forever thereafter, just for a couple of years at a higher wage. And Illinois went around, fixed it, got a law to fix it. I'm not sure if it's necessarily the Illinois way that now districts have, in a sense, found a way around it and just, give this 6% cap. But that's in general how things work. Businesses, for example, find all sorts of windows in tax code that they can take advantage of. It's the nature. You find something and you take advantage of it and you work the system and then it gets changed again. Point being, though, does Rauner have a point? Things really were worse off than Democrats, than he also says Republicans are in part responsible, than legislators of the past have admitted. And does that IGPA report, kind of prove it?
I would say if you're talking about the average person, the average individual on the street who's worried about paying the mortgage, worried about feeding the kids, worried about keeping the heat on in the house, yeah, he's probably not well aware of all this stuff. But anybody who follows state government, members of the General Assembly, reporters, one would hope candidates for major state office, should have found this as no surprise. As a matter of fact, all the complaining that the governor has done about the current budget, I had no idea it was so bad. Well, maybe he should have gone back and read the transcripts of the complaints that Republican lawmakers made last May when the Democratic majority pushed through what was an incomplete budget and was criticized by then Governor Quinn for doing such a lousy job. So it was no secret to anybody who was paying attention. But as you said, politically for the governor, it makes sense to pretend like, oh my goodness, the sky is falling, and I thought it was just a few pieces of plaster coming down.
And it's worth mentioning that Pat Quinn used to do the same thing with his budget presentations. He'd give the doomsday version, and then anything else that he did later in comparison would look rosy. So it's kind of one of those, we're going to set it up this way, and then it's going to make me look better when it's not as bad as what I originally said.
It does seem to me that, so in these speeches, Rauner presents the challenges, and it is a whole list of things that harken back really to his agenda. So I think were you to see Pat Quinn give a speech of, what's wrong with Illinois from a foundational standpoint, it would be a very different speech. Rauner, for example, points to, and this is really, as I noted earlier, kind of the juicy part, because it goes back to unions. He says that many of Illinois' troubles are, well, we'll kind of go through them one by one. I'll give a quick rundown here, but the prevailing wage and requiring that be paid for state projects or government projects, project labor agreements that, as Rauner at least puts it, unions would say no, but as Rauner puts it, agreements that allow governmental entities and unions to work out a deal and then bidders don't really have any chance, and then also right to work. This is, however, coming from a man who has said, even in these very same speeches, I'm not anti-union. I'm not. I'm just anti-government union bosses. I'm anti-forced unionization. Unions aren't buying it. It is U of I speech. There were a whole lot of protesters. AFSCME, AFL-CIO were out there. Let's just give the rundown one by one, starting with right to work. And Pat, he doesn't want right to work statewide.
Right. He wants these right to work zones, which I'm not really sure what that would entail. I guess just we just cordon off an area, and inside that area, you don't have to belong to a union if it's a union shop. Mm-hmm. The problem with that, of course, is that if you work in a union shop and you don't belong to the union, we have provision, we have ways to deal with that. But generally, you're reaping the benefits of that union's work and negotiation with the company.
You're getting a pay increase.
Exactly,
you're getting health care benefits
without basically providing anything, without basically paying your dues.
Your membership fee.
Exactly. And so it basically it's an unfair situation for the unions and for the workers, and it basically ends up weakening the union. And so when they say right to work, it's really more of a code on their part to basically weaken the union's representative strength.
Unions say it's a right to work less.
Right.
Work for less, yeah.
But Rauner says that this will make Illinois more competitive, and he has these slides that show.
If we reduced our minimum wage to $2 an hour, we'd be able to draw in all kinds of...
We could compete with China.
Yeah, and see, the thing that bothers me, and there was a study that came out last...
Another U of I study.
No, this,
right?
This is one from the Economic Policy Institute, which is a Washington think tank, and it analyzed income distribution, and it went all the way back to the 1920s. And the gap between the extremely wealthy and the rest of America is greater now than at any time since the Roaring '20s, right before the Great Depression. After the Great Depression, as we were coming out of the crash and the New Deal under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the inequities kind of were narrowed. And then starting about 1979, according to this study by a couple of economists, they began to grow and grow and grow, and now they're up there where the gap is as big as it's ever been. And there's been this
consolidation of wealth.
and there's this hollowing out of the middle class. And interestingly enough, the same time that the middle class has been decimated and not sharing in all this growth and wealth, corresponds to a time when union membership has declined. And the folks at the top who are reaping all these benefits, in my judgment, in part are able to do it because workers no longer have that collective ability to stand up to the hierarchy.
You can't really say that in state government, at least in Illinois, however.
No.
We have one of the most unionized workforces. Sure. Rauner says it. He's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe that's one of the reasons why state workers have decent salaries.
And Bruce Rauner, that's where I guess, I can't get away from this. I wanted to kind of delay it and go through the issues from a substantial standpoint, but you can't ignore the hypocrisy might be a bit strong. I'm a reporter, but that's what many people say and point out as they're listening to him. You have Rauner 1 week giving a video that goes out to all Illinois employees that says, I want you to be paid a solid wage. I want you to have bonuses. I want this to be a great place to work. And then a speech that says everybody gets paid too much. I don't understand. And I don't want that. And we need to, be it right to work. He says, I am, same thing with the minimum wage. I'm for the minimum wage. But again, people get paid too much. It's anti-competitive. And it also, during these speeches, one of the other reasons that in Rauner's eyes, Illinois is lagging behind in some rankings is what he says is a problem with basically the judicial system and elections, and judges are getting money from trial lawyers, and it's also the donations that unions have given to Democratic candidates. So Pat Quinn, he says this is a corrupt bargain. And yet, this is a guy who, of course, broke records and lifted off campaign caps for the first time they were supposed to be in place. He put more money into his campaign than Illinois has ever seen. So what, it's okay for him to put as much as he wants, a rich guy, as long as it's your money, but nobody else?
It seems like he doesn't have any qualms when it comes to corporate donations, which are unlimited thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. He doesn't really have any qualms when it comes to that. But if it's unions, if it's somebody that's not opposed, but on the other on the other side of his pro-business agenda, then clearly that's a problem, and it just, like you said, hypocrisy may be too strong a word, but there is definitely he has a vested interest basically in making sure that his business buddies, prosper, and typically that comes at the expense of the workers.
I mean, it just feels almost like there's a bit of whiplash almost. Like, what Rauner, the nice guy Rauner or the beat down the hatches Rauner? Yeah. What one are you going to get?
Right. And it's very much worth noting that a lot of the pressures that he's been talking about have been due to the underfunding of pensions. And we need to be clear about something. The long-term funding of the pensions absolutely is abysmal. I mean, we're $100 billion roughly in underfunding, but the short term...
And he's right, that's largely because the legislators, they didn't want to make hard choices, they didn't want to raise taxes.
But in the short term, all of those funds have enough money to pay all of their current retirees, and in fact, one of them even told me that they could continue paying through 2030, even without any further payments by the state. So, this notion that we have this huge pension crisis is true in the long term, but it is not a short-term crisis. It's basically a manufactured crisis. And when we talk about all of this, when we talk about who needs to make sacrifices, it's never holding the legislature accountable, the ones who actually made the problem. It ends up coming on the backs of the workers. And when they say, well, we don't want to have to put the solution on the backs of Illinois families, well, you're doing that by the way that you want to approach the problem.
And part of it, and I find this, what would you say, troublesome, is that people say, oh, we have a pension debt, and I think the latest estimate is
$11 billion?
Well, it's $111 billion, where the commitments we've made to the workforce exceed the money that's likely to be there. But that's not money that has to be paid immediately. Right. As Pat said, this is over time. It would be like me saying, oh my gosh, I have this mortgage and the mortgage is greater than my annual salary. What am I going to do?
Right, you don't have to pay that mortgage all at once.
The mortgage is, for most people, it's probably over 30 years.
But let's be clear, Illinois is all over the place.
Sure.
As the number one for that pension debt. At some point it's got to come due. Sure, we've got a long time, but you got to get out of it. That bill will eventually one day come due. Right. And it's hurt the state's credit rating. It is continually looked upon. This is not just Illinois. Other states are experiencing something similar, but Illinois is at a magnitude far worse than any other. So you can say, no, it's not an immediate crisis, but I mean, it's something that there's a lot of clamoring to be dealt with.
But I mean, there are immediate crises. For example, what are you going to do in the FY16 budget? But as a matter of fact, if we just follow the existing law, right, if we just follow the existing law and make the payments as that 1995 law dictates, by the year 2045, the pension systems will be funded at, I believe, 90% of what the liabilities are.
Not that far away. That time flies by.
Well,
sadly,
but if we just follow, and the thing is that the 1995 law started out modestly, and then it's ramped up considerably. Now we're past most of the ramp-up period. I think the.
Well, why did the legislators do that now? I'm kidding.
For the same reasons they didn't fund it in the first
Political
place.
expediency, exactly.
But to the credit of the people at that time, they actually put a law on the books that requires the payments. And it's just that the magnitude of the debt that we owe is so great. I think the pension payments are in the neighborhood this year around $7 billion. Maybe $1 billion of it is, these are the value of the benefits earned by people this year. And I'd be one of them because I'm in the state university retirement system. So my service this year is going to earn me certain pension benefits should I ever decide to retire.
Never. It's not going to happen.
But the cost of those benefits for myself, all the other university employees, including you, all the downstate suburban teachers, all the state employees, taken together, they're only slightly more than $1 billion is the value of the benefits we earned. All the rest of that is money to make up for money that wasn't put in by the employer.
That's what Rauner says. He says, I want to deal with it. He says, there's enough of that, no more. We're going to deal with it this time around.
Well, there's no way you can retire that
immediately. Oh, no, this is not a quick snap. No. And I don't think he's promised that either. He's just saying no more of that.
It's because
I think
the money wasn't there, and the interest the money should have earned never materialized.
So it's a long-term I think Rauner is right. Illinois politicians in the past have behaved poorly in that regard. I mean, that's $111 billion that didn't arise over 1 year. There were
there are studies that say it goes back to the 19-teens.
Right.
It's almost like 100 years.
So let's go back, though, too, because I think really people were taken aback by, pensions. He has not said any more in terms of what he wants to do other than a promise of big pension reform. But that's where we have gotten these glimpses, these right-to-work opportunity zones, and also his comments about the prevailing wage and project labor agreements. That was new. As Charlie noted, the primary candidate, Rauner, was very anti-union and talked about this corrupt bargain lot. But then literally, I remember covering Rauner the very day after he won the nomination. There was a big Republican breakfast, and so in the morning he holds a press availability, and I asked him, I said, hey, I didn't hear you say government union bosses once. I've heard you say that about 10 times every day since you came into the political forefront. What's happening? And he just glided over the question. I'm not anti-union. I'm not anti-union. And then on Saturday and again at his speech at Richland Community College, people really taken aback by the seemingly change of tone. As I said, he still says he's not anti-union. It's just these policies that he's against that he says are costing the state money. And because of prevailing wage and these agreements between government and labor, Illinois or other governmental entities, schools, for example, are paying more for construction of roads, of school buildings than they need to. It's costing you, the taxpayer, more, and you're getting less than you should. In Illinois, is that a huge mistake for him to come out and do it? Do these have any sort of chance? We've got Democratic supermajorities in the General Assembly, and we have a lot of Republicans who are friends of unions because state employees are often downstate in these downstate districts represented by the GOP. Was this a mistake?
I think it's kind of still being on the campaign trail, and he's throwing these people out, and you begin to wonder, who is the audience?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But seriously, is the audience just those folks there in the community college in Decatur, or is the audience perhaps on a national level, and is this guy thinking, well, I'd like to be president, or I'd maybe like to be vice president? And we chuckle, but on the other hand, if you look at it from afar, a Republican winning the governorship in a blue state like Illinois automatically,
as Rauner would say, big deal, big deal.
Yeah, it catapults him onto the national scene. I remember years ago when Jim Thompson was elected governor, he was looked at as a potential presidential candidate. And so that's kind of natural. And if you're serious about it, and if you have these notions about, well, maybe I'd like to do that, then you need to attract big money, even though you're extremely wealthy
money,
yourself.
You need more than that.
Yeah, you need big money from outside, and so you give the kind of message for the national audience.
Isn't it early for that, though? You have to get some successes under your belt as governor, and does this make it harder for him to have success? There's already talk of this hurting perhaps some of his selections for appointments, not being able to get through the Senate.
Let me go back in time. Remember when Rod Blagojevich first came into office? And he did a lot of stuff, and we're in Illinois, we're scratching our heads.
He got a lot of national attention.
Yeah, and that's why he did it, because at one point he envisioned, believe it or not, he envisioned himself as being a serious candidate for the U.S. president.
Little did he know what sort of national figure he would become, huh?
Well, yeah, and at the time he wasn't assuming that here this kind of run-of-the-mill senator from the south side of Chicago would suddenly become a serious presidential candidate and ultimately be elected twice. So these guys, I think it's fair to say.
You think that's the strategy?
It could be. That would make sense to me.
Any other ideas,
and one of the things,
Pat, do you have any other ideas?
Well, if nothing else, I think he's giving the kind of speech that he knows people, maybe not at that community college, but people who pay only marginal attention to the state news will hear and think, oh yeah, I've heard that Illinois has financial problems. That must be why.
This is bogus. Why are these people getting paid
right,
more?
Right, exactly. And so that, I mean, for people who only pay marginal attention to state, state house news, that really is a message that resonates. Oh, those big fat cat union bosses are, stripping us of all of our hard-earned tax dollars. And whether or not that's true is, a different story. But that message resonates, absolutely. And I think that might be part of his audience as well.
And so it begins. We'll hear more during his State of the State address before we wrap up the show, which is coming to an end oh so quickly. I do want to get in some other news this week, going back to Rauner being put in potentially maybe a tough spot. He had said on the campaign trail that he did not like the medical marijuana that Illinois passed because it was basically hidden who was going to apply and who would win awards, the names, the connections. We thought that we were going to get Governor Pat Quinn approving who would be able to grow and sell medical marijuana before he left office. And now it turns out he was all ready to do so. There was a press release. Stuff had been ready. The night before he was going to be done doing governor, it was going to be one of his last acts. And instead, he didn't do it. Pat, can you clue us in? Some people think this is maybe Pat Quinn not wanting to show his ties to some of these big lobbyists, that had connections.
Very possible. I mean, the whole situation was very clandestine. They wanted to make sure that nobody who put their name into the hat to get a license would.
These are lucrative licenses.
Right, very lucrative. I mean, extremely lucrative. This could be a multi-billion-dollar industry if it ends up becoming more than a pilot program eventually. And so those folks who get on the ground floor have, a very, lucrative, interest if they get chosen. If they get chosen. And so they made this whole process, secret, and it's not even subject to FOIA, which, us reporters don't really like that at all.
No.
And so you looked like you were gonna.
Yeah, I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately. So we'll be talking about more of this ahead, I am quite sure, because it is intriguing. What all does Rauner know? What did Quinn know? Why didn't it go forward? You can find us on Facebook if you have any interests, comments, insight into any of these things. That's at CapitolView Politics. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thanks so much to Pat Yeagle of the Illinois Times, Charlie Wheeler, head of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS, and I'm Amanda Vinicky with Illinois Public Radio and WUIS. Thanks so much.